I grew up in a small, quiet town in the Kiev region. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your family back 3 generations. We had one central square, a single large grocery store that doubled as a local meeting point, and one high school. After graduation, the paths were predictable. You either went to work at the local bakery, joined the railway station crew, or left for the capital to chase bigger dreams. I chose the ambulance service. Right after finishing a basic medical college course in the nearby city, I returned home. It wasn't anything fancy, just enough to get certified as a paramedic and stay close to my elderly parents. By the time I turned 21, I was running emergency calls through the very same fields and back roads I used to bike down as a kid. It wasn't glamorous. The pay was modest, but it gave me a profound sense of purpose. In a small town, helping a neighbor through a midnight heart attack feels like you're holding the fabric of the community together. And for a long time, that was enough. Most of our night shifts were slow. You learn to live in that strange, suspended animation known only to first responders half asleep, fully dressed, boots laced, waiting for the radio to shatter the silence. You always hoped that whatever broke the quiet wouldn't be a tragedy involving someone you shook hands with at the market the day before. But everything changed in late February 2022. The silence of our small town didn't just break, it vanished entirely, replaced by the distant, low thudding of artillery echoing from the horizon. The sky to the north was constantly tinged with a faint, unnatural orange glow. Half the town had already evacuated, leaving behind eerie, dark streets with taped windows. Those of us who stayed, medics, firefighters, and a few local volunteers, moved our staging area to the basement of an old cultural center. It was a sturdy, Soviet-era brick building with thick walls, originally built in the 1950s. Our makeshift bunk room was in the former music class downstairs. To get to our ambulance parked in the courtyard, we had to walk through a long corridor lined with abandoned pianos and dusty theater props, then up a narrow flight of concrete stairs. It was just after 3 o'clock in the morning when the direct landline phone rang. Not the main regional dispatch radio, which had been glitching for days to damage cell towers, but the old copper wire phone we kept on the desk. I jumped to my feet instantly. My shift partner, Baden, a seasoned paramedic in his late 40s who had seen his fair share of crises, was already reaching for his medical bag. I picked up the receiver. Emergency medical service. Listening. At first, there was only heavy static. Then, the sound of rustling papers, shallow, rapid breathing, and a sudden click as the line went dead. I stared at the receiver, frowning, and hung it up. Less than a minute later, it rang again. "Hello," I said louder. No voice answered, but this time I could hear a distinct background noise underneath the crackle of the wire. It was the sound of wind, the distant rumble of an engine, and a rhythmic, metallic tapping. By the third time the phone rang, Baden was standing right over my shoulder, his jacket zipped up. The tension in the basement was palpable. "Is it a prank?" I muttered, trying to convince myself. Baden shook his head, his face grim in the dim light of the battery-powered lamp. "Not right now. Nobody is playing pranks in this town anymore. Listen closely." We leaned in. Through the static, we didn't hear a scream of terror, but rather a voice, faint, strained, and breathless. It was an elderly woman's voice, repeating a single phrase over and over like a mantra. "Near the old windmill. The bridge is gone. Please." And then, the line cut out completely. Seconds later, our regional military civilian dispatch crackled to life over the encrypted radio wave. "Ambulance Team 4, we have a civilian distress signal forwarded from the Territorial Defense Checkpoint, an isolated farmhouse near the old railway bypass. No stable phone connection. Possible trauma. Proceed with extreme caution. Lights off." We slipped out into the courtyard, the cold February air instantly hitting our faces. The sky was pitch black, stripped of all street lights due to the strict blackout regulations. I climbed into the passenger seat while Baden took the wheel of our old Volkswagen ambulance. We didn't turn on the flashing blue lights, let alone the siren. Driving with sirens at night back then was an invitation for panic. Or worse, it could draw unnecessary attention on the empty roads. We relied entirely on our low beams, which were half covered with black tape to minimize visibility from above. The drive out of town felt twice as long as it usually did. As soon as you passed the last local grocery store, the landscape flattened into endless fields and dense pine forests. Normally, you'd see the cozy lights of neighboring villages in the distance, but tonight, everything was swallowed by an oppressive, heavy darkness. "Do you know who lives out by the old railway bypass?" I asked Baden, my eyes straining to catch the outline of the asphalt ahead. "An old couple, I think," Baden replied quietly, his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. "The husband used to work at the grain elevator. They refused to leave when the evacuation buses came last week, said their roots were too deep in this soil to abandon it now. The road began to deteriorate rapidly, transitioning from potholed asphalt to packed, frozen mud as we turned toward the bypass. The branches of the overgrown pine trees scraped loudly against the sides of the ambulance box along, agonizing screech that made my nerves jump. Every few minutes, a low, deep thud of artillery would reverberate through the chassis of the car. It wasn't close enough to threaten us directly, but it was a constant reminder that the world we knew was shifting beneath our feet. Suddenly, the ambulance's built-in GPS screen flickered violently and went entirely blank. I pulled out my phone to check our offline maps, but the screen just showed a blinking gray arrow hovering over an empty grid. The local cell towers were completely down. "We're on our own coordinates now," I muttered, tossing the phone onto the dashboard. "Look ahead," Baden said, slowing the vehicle down to a crawl, just off the shoulder of the dirt road. Near the skeletal silhouette of an abandoned Soviet-era windmill sat an old gray sedan. The driver's side door was swung wide open, swaying slightly in the cold wind. The engine was off, and there were no lights on. But as our taped headlights swept over the vehicle, my heart skipped a beat. The driver's side of the car, along with the frozen mud right next to the open door, was stained with something dark and wet. It didn't take a medical degree to recognize the unmistakable, deep sheen of fresh blood. Baden pulled the handbrake. "Stay behind me." Grabbed the trauma kit and the heavy flashlight. We stepped out into the biting cold. The silence out here was different from the town. It was eerie, almost fragile, punctuated only by the clicking of our cooling engine. I shone my flashlight in a tight, narrow beam toward the ground. Right beside the car's front tire lay a shattered smartphone. The screen was cracked, but it was still faintly glowing, displaying an active call screen that had finally timed out. It was covered in dark smears. "Hello. Emergency medical service." I called out into the dark tree line. My voice felt incredibly small against the vastness of the forest. No one answered. The interior of the sedan was empty, but the steering wheel and the keys still dangling in the ignition were splattered with blood. It looked like a sudden, violent scene, yet there was no sign of a collision, no shelling craters nearby, and no footprints leading away into the mud, just the dense, impenetrable wall of trees. I reached for our portable radio to update our base, but all that came out of the speaker was a wall of heavy, dead static. "Baden, we need to go back to the main path and wait for a territorial defense escort," I whispered, my intuition screaming that something was deeply wrong. "This looks like an ambush or a civilian caught in a crossfire." Before Baden could answer, the thick brush directly behind us exploded with a heavy, frantic rustling sound. I spun around, throwing the flashlight's beam toward the noise. A figure burst out of the trees at a full. The man's hands were completely mangled. Where his fingers should have been, there were only jagged, bleeding wounds, severely damaged tissues, and a heavy flow of dark blood pulsing down his wrists. He had managed to preserve only his thumbs. My paramedic training took over the shock before my brain could fully process the gruesome sight. "Baden, the trauma kit. Now, bring the tourniquets and pressure dressings," I yelled, stepping back slightly to avoid the pooling blood but maintaining a firm grip on the man's jacket. "Sir, listen to my voice. Look at me," Baden said, his voice dropping into that calm, authoritative tone that only decades on the job can build. He grabbed the young man by the shoulders, guiding him gently but firmly toward the back step of the ambulance. "Sit down right here. Take a deep breath. You are with the medics. We are going to stop the bleeding, but you need to stay with us." The young man didn't sit at first. He kept pacing in chaotic, tight circles on the frozen mud, his jaw chattering so hard I thought he might break his teeth. His eyes were wide, dilated with terror, showing far too much white. He was incredibly pale from the rapid blood loss and severe shock. I could see him biting his tongue out of sheer panic, drawing even more blood from his mouth. "My phone. I kept dropping it," he gibbered, his words tripping over one another in a hysterical rush. "The bridge. We heard the explosions near the main highway. So, we tried to take the dirt road bypass, but it was pitch black. We hit a deep pothole, shattered the wheel rim, and the tire went flat instantly. I had to change it. We had to keep moving. Baden and I knelt beside him as he finally collapsed onto the ambulance step. We worked with practice, Rapid movements. I grabbed thick layers of sterile gauze, packing the bleeding ends of his hands as tightly as possible, while Baden readied the Israeli battle dressings to apply maximum pressure. In the dim, taped light of the vehicle, our hands were quickly covered in his warm blood. Apply the pressure. Turn it hard, Baden muttered to me, his eyes locked on the wounds. We need to control the arterial flow before he passes out. Hey, stay with me. What is your name? I asked the boy, trying to keep his mind grounded as I tightened the pressure bandage around his right wrist. He groaned in agony, his head snapping back against the metal frame of the ambulance door. Artem. My name is Artem, he gasped, his vision unfocusing for a second. I was using the mechanical jack, the cheap one from the trunk. The ground was soft mud, not solid asphalt, but I didn't care. I was in such a hurry because of the artillery sounds. I crawled under the wheel well to position the spare tire. I had my hands right over the brake disc, holding the bolts. He stopped, a bizarre, breathless laugh escaping his lips, a clear sign of deep psychological shock. And then, Baden urged gently, securing the second bandage. The jack slipped, Artem whispered, his eyes staring blankly into the dark forest. The mud gave way under the weight. The whole front frame of the heavy sedan came crashing down in a split second. It caught my hands right between the rusted metal edge and the frozen ground. It didn't just cut them, it crushed them completely. I pulled back out of instinct, and there was nothing left. All of them gone. It took all of them. My stomach dropped. The sheer horror of the realization hit me. This wasn't an attack by enemy scouts. It wasn't a deliberate ambush or a landmine. It was a tragic, desperate accident born entirely out of the panic of wartime. The repeated, silent phone calls we had received at the cultural center basement suddenly made perfect sense. I couldn't dial. Artem continued, tears finally cutting clean lines through the dirt and blood on his pale face. I found my phone in the mud, but I couldn't press the screen. No fingers. I used my nose. I used my thumbs. I managed to hit the emergency speed dial to the local station, but the cell connection kept dropping out. I couldn't hear if anyone answered. I thought nobody was coming. I thought we were going to bleed out in the middle of nowhere. Wait, what do you mean we? I froze, looking up from his wrapped wrists. My eyes locked onto his. Artem. Who else is out here? Artem's jaw trembled as he pointed his bandaged, bulky wrist back toward the open door of the gray sedan. My grandfather. He was inside the car. He has a bad heart. When the car collapsed and I started screaming, he tried to get out to help me, but he collapsed right onto the passenger seat. He isn't moving. Please. You have to check the car. Leaving Baden to secure the heavy pressure dressings on Artem's mangled wrists, I grabbed my primary medical bag and stepped back into the freezing dark. Every second counted. If Artem's grandfather had suffered a cardiac arrest from the sheer shock of seeing his grandson crushed, our window of opportunity was terrifyingly narrow. I approached the open door of the gray sedan, my boots crunching heavily on the frozen gravel. The metallic, heavy smell of blood hung thick in the air, mixed with the sharp scent of cold engine oil and exhaust. I aimed my flashlight inside the cabin. An elderly man was slouched heavily over the passenger seat, his upper body tilted toward the center console. He wore a heavy, worn winter coat and a knitted cap that had slipped sideways. His eyes were closed, his face completely pale under the harsh beam of my light. Sir, can you hear me? It's the emergency medical team, I said loudly, reaching into the car to place the fingers firmly on his carotid artery. Nothing. I shifted my fingers slightly, pressing deeper into the cold skin, counting the agonizing seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. There, a pulse. It was incredibly faint, thready, and irregular like a fragile thread fraying under immense tension, but it was there. He was alive, but his breathing was critically shallow, barely moving his chest. Baden. He's got a pulse, but it's dropping fast. Bradycardia, possible acute myocardial infarction triggered by stress. I yelled back toward the ambulance. We need to move him now. Prepare the stretcher and the oxygen. Understood. Baden called back. I could hear him guiding Artem into the back of the ambulance, ensuring the boy was strapped safely onto the side bench so we could free up the main gurney. Keep his airway clear. I'm coming. I carefully leaned into the cramped vehicle, bracing my feet against the slick mud. In the tight space of the sedan, managing a potential cardiac patient alone was a nightmare. I checked his pupils, sluggish but reactive. He was in a deep coma induced by cardiogenic shock. Gently but quickly, I unbuckled his seatbelt and hooked my arms under his shoulders, slowly dragging his dead weight out of the passenger side. just as I pulled him free from the cabin. Baden arrived at my side with the wheeled stretcher. Together, using every bit of strength we had, we lifted the elderly man onto the mattress and secured the straps. The cold wind howled through the pine trees above us, carrying the distant, low rumble of the front line. But right now, our entire universe was contained within the small perimeter of our flashlights. We wheeled the grandfather to the back of the ambulance and slid the stretcher into the locking mechanism on the floor. The interior of the rig instantly felt incredibly cramped. On the side bench sat Artem, his bulky, bandaged arms held close to his chest, his face streaked with tears and dirt as he stared at his unconscious grandfather. Is he alive? Artem whispered, his voice cracking, all the manic energy from before completely drained out of him. He's fighting. Artem, and so are we, I said, instantly tearing open an oxygen mask and fitting it over the old man's face. I dialed the flow meter up to maximum. Baden, start a line. We need peripheral access immediately. Give him a bolus of saline and prepare the cardiac monitor. The ambulance became a blur of rhythmic, silent teamwork, while Baden expertly slipped an for catheter into the grandfather's fragile vein despite the bouncing of the vehicle's suspension. I attached the 4-lead ECG cables to the chest. The monitor gave a sharp, high-pitched beep, and a jagged, dangerously slow line began to crawl across the digital screen. Look at that rhythm, Baden muttered, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted the 4-drip. It's a massive inferior wall STEMI. His heart is failing from the trauma of the situation. I reached for our portable radio one more time, hoping that being closer to the ambulance near its heavy antenna would help pierce through the interference. I squeezed the transmitter button. Team for to base. We have 2 critical casualties at the bypass. 1 young male with dramatic amputation of fingers on both hands, severe blood loss controlled. 1 elderly male, acute coronary syndrome, cardiogenic shock. We are initiating immediate transport to the regional hospital. Do you copy? For a long 3 seconds, there was only the cold hiss of dead air. Then, through a thick curtain of static, a faint, fragmented voice broke through. Double quotes team. 4, copy. Regional hospital. Warning. The main highway route. Compromised. Bypass. Repeat. Do not take the main road. The static on the radio died as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the urgent, high-pitched beep. 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 Of the grandfather's cardiac monitor fill the cramped interior of the Volkswagen. The main road is compromised, Baden repeated, his voice low, thinking through the tactical options in an instant. If the territorial defense is blocking it or if they're shelling near the junction, we can't risk getting stuck in a queue or turning back. We have to push forward through the old forestry trail on the other side of the bypass. It leads directly to the back entrance of the regional medical center. But that path isn't cleared. Baden. It's all mud and steep declines. I protested, holding the oxygen mask firmly over the old man's face. We don't have a choice, Baden said grimly, sliding into the driver's seat and slamming the cabin door shut. Hold onto the stretcher. It's going to be rough. The ambulance jolted violently as Baden shifted into gear and threw the heavy vehicle forward. Without the main highway, the drive transformed into a harrowing race against time. The ambulance rocked side to side, tires spinning and slipping through the thick, unfrozen winter mud of the forest track. Every deep pothole sent a shockwave through the vehicle, forcing me to lean my entire body weight over the gurney to keep the grandfather stable, while ensuring Artem didn't slide off the side bench. He's slipping into ventricular tachycardia. I shouted over the roar of the straining engine, staring at the monitor as the wave pattern transformed into a jagged, chaotic zigzag. His blood pressure is bottoming out. Hold on. We are crossing the old river bridge now. Baden yelled back. Through the small window connecting the cabin to the medical box, I could see the skeletal pine trees whipping past our taped headlights. The sheer determination in Baden's driving was the only thing keeping us on the road. I tore open our emergency drug kit, pulling out an ampule of amiodarone, my hands shaking from the constant vibrations of the vehicle. I pushed the medication through the IV line Baden had meticulously established just minutes prior. Beside me, Artem sat perfectly still. The initial hysterical panic had completely left him, replaced by a solemn, frozen realization. He looked down at his bulky, white-bandaged wrists, then at his grandfather's pale face under the oxygen mask. Please, Artem whispered, his jaw no longer chattering, his voice remarkably clear against the chaos of the ride. He's all the family I have left in this province. Don't let him die because of my stupid mistake. We are here, Hang on. Bowden's voice cut through the tension. The rough, uneven vibrations of the dirt road suddenly smoothed out into concrete. The ambulance swung sharply to the left, the tires screeching against the asphalt as we burst into the rear courtyard of the regional hospital. The building was also in complete blackout, but the emergency room entrance was marked by a faint, blue-tinted light bulb. The moment the doors swung open, a team of doctors and nurses, who had been waiting in the dark corridor, rushed out with a specialized gurney. Massive STEMI, cardiogenic shock, stabilized with oxygen and antiarrhythmics. I reported rapidly, helping them transfer the grandfather and the boy bilateral traumatic amputation of fingers to a mechanical jack accident. Severe blood loss controlled with pressure dressings. The staff moved with incredible, quiet efficiency born from weeks of constant crisis. Within seconds, both patients were wheeled down the long, dark hallway toward the operating theater. BOHDAN, and I stood under the faint blue light of the empty loading dock. The adrenaline slowly leaving our systems, leaving behind a crushing, heavy exhaustion. The cold February wind swept through the courtyard, carrying the smell of ozone and damp earth. I looked down at my uniform. My chest and sleeves were deeply stained with Artem's blood. Bowden pulled the crumpled cigarettes from his pocket, lighting one and handing it to me. We didn't say a word for a long time. In the spring of 2022, you quickly learned that horror didn't always come from the sky in the form of missiles. Sometimes, the deepest tragedies were just ordinary people, caught in the grip of absolute panic, trying their best to survive the night on the dark, forgotten roads of their own home. Come on, Bowden said finally, tossing his cigarette butt into the mud and wiping his brow. Let's clean the rig. Base said there's another call waiting for us near the station.